Alright, so today is day 2 and I'm now leaving Vairão and going to Barcelinhos. The guidebooks tell you to go to Barcelos, but the thing is, it looks like in Barcelos there's really only like hotels, like private room kind of accommodations. There aren't any albergues or hostels, but Barcelinhos is right next to it, like just maybe a kilometer closer. So I'm going to try my luck there today. There's a few albergues there, and today's mileage should be something like 17 miles, I think. So similar to yesterday, but just slightly longer. Yeah, so yesterday after I got in, took my nap, I wandered around a little. I went to a mini market, got an apple, some Doritos. The town is super, super small, so it was kind of cool to see the mini market kind of had a mix of everything. She had, some foods, she had clothes, and the lady working there was super friendly, asking if I was a pilgrim. And then I was chatting with some other ladies that I met in the albergue. Funnily enough, one of them had done the French Way 2 years ago as well. And then we got some drinks at the mini market, and then we went to dinner. And yeah, we were a little worried because as we were just getting our drinks at the mini market, we saw the man who had checked us in at the albergue, and he was saying something like, "It's getting late, you ladies need your sleep." And we were like, "Well, isn't the restaurant opening at 8 p.m.? Like, we're hungry, we're waiting for food." And he was like, "No, the kitchen closes at 8. And at this point, it was like 7:55. So we quickly finished our drinks and hurried over to the restaurant. I don't really know what he was talking about because I saw some people ordering food later at like 9 p.m. So thankfully, we got some food. It definitely wasn't that great. This is the only restaurant in town, but it was something. So got back, got our clothes off the laundry drying line, and went to sleep. And now here I am starting day 2. Well, the walk out of Vairão has been absolutely beautiful, so different from the urban walk I had yesterday. It's just been super quiet walking along this cobblestone road, and then about 1 mile in, I reached a bridge that's at least 800 years old, so that was so beautiful with the sun rising and seeing, the birds and the river and hearing the birds chirping and just really enjoying that quiet, peaceful moment. I haven't seen many pilgrims out yet. I did start fairly early, but I did see one of my friends that I met last night, and I'm sure I'll start to see some more folks maybe later today. Darn. Well, I had hoped that a little town would have an open cafe. I saw a cafe on Google Maps, but as I was walking through, it seemed everything was super quiet. It seemed pretty shut down there. I think here, like Spain too, they tend to have a bit of a later culture. Folks will get up a little bit later, stay up a little bit later, have all of their meals later. It is also a Saturday morning, so maybe during the week it's a little more busy. I don't know, but that's part of the Camino. You really have to be flexible. You have to know that you can hope that there's a cafe, but you want to plan to have snacks, walk a little bit further, do what you need to do. So yeah, honestly, I think it can be stressful at times, but in a lot of ways, I really love it. I love this go with the flow kind of vibe that you kind of have to take on the Camino. So my first impressions of the Camino Portugués Central compared to the French Way, just, based on my day and a few hours here, so it could change. But the main things I've noticed are there really don't seem to be as many people. I was worried yesterday about finding a bed. I thought, 60 beds in an albergue is small, because I'm used to the French way where, some of the albergues have 100, 200 beds. So, yeah, but as I was hiking yesterday, I barely saw any other pilgrims. And then even when I got to my albergue, I think by the time I went to sleep, I counted there were 6 women in my room. There were a ton of bunk beds left. We were all on the bottom. No one was on the top bunk. There were other rooms in that albergue, but I think there were tons and tons and tons of beds still available for people. So, really not as busy as I expected. I'm slightly more nervous today because the albergues are smaller, but just since there haven't been as many people out, I think it should be okay. The other thing I've noticed, it seems like, at least so far for the first few days in the guidebook, it's telling me to go to these cities or these towns, but then they don't really have albergues, or they don't have many of them, and they don't even have municipal albergues, but there are these smaller villages close by that do. So I would definitely recommend, if you want to stay flexible, you don't want to book ahead, and you want to keep your trip more affordable and stay in a shared dorm, then definitely don't limit yourself to whatever your guidebook says you should be doing. The other thing that I experienced last night, but it's only one night, so I'm not going to say this is how it's necessarily going to be, but I have heard that there are less like pilgrims menus on the Portuguese route. The Portuguese in general are big on like a menu of the day, so I've heard places do have that sometimes, but they don't necessarily have a menu, specifically catered to pilgrims. Yay, so I found lunch here in the town of Arcos. Really nice little cafe. Got a Tosta Mista, if I'm saying that right. Tosta Mista. That's like a ham and cheese toasted sandwich. But I think it's common here even for breakfast. So that was lovely. And then I had a cappuccino. And as I was sitting outside, I saw some of my friends walking by, and they joined me. So that was very nice to see them. I think that's one of the fun parts of the Camino. You might be walking alone for hours, but then, after some time you start bumping into people you've met before. So it's always kind of fun to see where you end up seeing each other, and, who you see again, who you maybe don't see again. So yeah. Well, it just started raining, so I had to pull out my rain gear. So I have my rain jacket, my rain pants, and then you can kind of see my pack cover, this yellow thing. It can rain quite a bit on the Camino, especially on some routes and, certain times of year. So you definitely want to make sure you bring rain gear so you're prepared. And, I recommend keeping it pretty readily accessible too, because you never really know when it could start raining, and you want to be able to quickly put everything on. Thankfully this time it just started with a very, very light rain at first, so it wasn't too bad, but I've seen it go from nothing beautiful sunny day to an absolute downpour before, so you want to be able to quickly get everything out. Yeah, so it's interesting, of course there's many different Camino routes, but you'll find that even, on one route there can be many different paths you can take. There are often, you know, splits in the path where it's like you could go one way and see something cool, or but it might be a little longer, or you know, there's just two options. They might even be pretty similar. So today actually there were two options, and theoretically I wanted to stick to kind of like the original path, but you know, the cafe I stopped at for breakfast was on the new path, and this one was a little more well marked, so just decided to go for that. But yeah, there's plenty of options, and that's just something to be aware of as you're doing your own hike. You may be presented with different choices, and you know, you may want to look into it and see, you know, what you'd rather do. In Portugal, there are a number of different pilgrimage routes, you know, not just the Camino. There is also, I might be getting the exact name wrong, but I think it's something like the Way of Fatima. I think it takes you to where that Fatima miracle took place. I don't know that much about it, honestly, but today, on day 2 of my hike, I have noticed some arrows for that hike as well. So, you know, if you're coming through here, you want to make sure you follow the yellow arrows. Yellow arrows are always for the Camino. You know, sometimes it's just a yellow arrow, nothing else. Sometimes it might be a yellow arrow with like a blue background. So follow those, and do not follow the blue arrows, because the blue arrows will take you to that Fatima route and are not the Camino. So naturally it went from rainy to really hot and sunny. So I didn't feel like getting my hat all the way out, but I had my buff handy. So this is actually the first time I'm using it kind of like this, as like a little bandana almost, just to help cover my scalp, because I feel like my scalp is already getting burned from all the traveling I was doing before this, and I definitely want to prevent that. So just another plug for the buff and how, you know, awesome it can be when you're hiking like this. You know, it's nice to have something so versatile that can help you, you know, stay warm and also protect yourself from the sun. So I was a little bit nervous, kind of way back on the trail at this point now, because I saw a Camino marker, but then I started looking at my app, and the app didn't have that path on it. And you know, there was a case, unfortunately, over 10 years ago now at this point, where a man had reworked the arrows to lead to his property, and he was charged for murdering a woman. So, you know, as a solo traveler, I definitely recommend having an app and keeping an eye on the map as you're going. In this case, you know, I looked at satellite image of the trail, and I could tell that it would meet back up with where my map said to go. And then, you know, I also noticed the marker looked very like official. It was one of the stone ones, you know, with the kilometers to Santiago. It wasn't just like a painted yellow arrow that anyone could have done. So that made me feel better, and it wasn't for very long, but thought I would put that PSA out. You know, definitely encourage you to have an app and look at the map, and, you know, just to be safe. Yeah, so I just hit 16 miles. I've been hiking now for about 5 hours, 45 minutes. and I think I am only maybe around 2 miles away. So, you know, I haven't had a break since around 9 a.m. when I stopped for breakfast. I would love to get lunch somewhere, but at this point, you know, I'm a little nervous about getting a bed since there are more albergues, but they all have fewer beds. So I'm just gonna keep on trekking over to Barcelinhos and then get something there after I check in, shower, do laundry. Now, of course, I just missed my turn, but thankfully I noticed pretty soon after, so I'm backtracking. But yeah, you'll find if you do the Camino, you know, sometimes the signage is a little harder to find, and it can be easy too to just kind of go on autopilot and totally miss a sign. So yeah, that's another reason I recommend, you know, having an app on your phone.
That's all I have for now, folks. If you liked this video, hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for more videos on my journey along the Camino Portugués.